A coughing widow kept 11 orphans fed by washing miners' clothes all winter. The first thing I noticed was the steam. Cold morning, end of October, frost still on the ground at 7 o'clock, and there was this white billow coming up off a washtub the size of a horse trough, set out behind the old Kavanaugh place. Woman bent over it with her back to me, both arms working a scrubbing board in that wrung-out, mechanical way that tells you she'd been at it since before first light. I had ridden past that property 100 times. I slowed the horse. She didn't look up. I rode on. I told myself it was none of my business. That was the first day. My name is Earl Dunmore. I still run, a cattle operation out of the Pinun Creek Valley, 60 miles north of the Mogollon Rim. Back then I had somewhere around 400 head, 12 hired men through summer, 3 through winter, more trouble with weather and creditors than I needed, and exactly one person in my life who gave a damn whether I came home in the evening, which was my dog, Creed. An ugly red-brown mutt, half shepherd, mostly some other argument. Good dog, though. Honest. I won't talk about the years before that. There were years, they ended, that's enough. What matters is this. I was a man who minded his own, kept to himself, and had gotten real comfortable with the idea that the best years of anything, company, softness, whatever you want to call what sits between two people in the evening, were behind him. I thought that right up until November. The woman's name was Nora Fenn. She was 38 years old. She had come to the territory from Iowa 6 years prior with a husband named George who died of a chest infection the previous winter, and she had, in her house at that moment, 11 children who were not hers. Not a single one of them. They were the orphaned and the left behind from 3 different families wiped out by a fever outbreak in the camp at Sutler's Creek, families who'd had nobody else, or whose nobody else had said they couldn't take in a child, thank you, and God bless. So Nora had. She hadn't intended to take in 11. She'd taken in 2, and then 3 more arrived on her porch with a note from a dying woman. And then the other 6 came in batches of 2 and 3 over the following month, sent by a minister in Prescott who had run out of other options, and apparently understood something about Nora Fenn that I would come to understand myself. She could not say no to a child. By the time I slowed my horse outside her fence that October morning, she was supporting 11 children between the ages of 4 and 13 on a dead man's small claim, which had, by then, produced nothing, and on what she could earn washing the clothes and bedding of the single miners at Sutler's Creek. She charged 4 cents per item. She washed in the cold before dawn and by lamplight after the children were in bed. She was also coughing. Not a little cough, the kind that bends a person in half, that sounds like something tearing loose inside. She'd had it since August. She hadn't seen a doctor because a doctor cost money, and she didn't have money she could spend on herself. I know all of that now. I didn't know it that morning. I just saw the steam and the bent-over woman and rode on. But I came back 2 days later. I told myself I was checking the creek crossing on that end of my property. That was a lie I told myself for about 3 minutes before I turned the horse right at the fork and went straight to her gate. I sat there a moment. She was out front this time, hanging a line of shirts, men's shirts, heavy canvas, dark with old sweat, and she heard the hooves and looked up. Her face was drawn, dark circles. She was pretty in the way that's mostly bone, the kind that outlasts the softness, and she was looking at me with the flat wariness that women alone develop when strange men stop at their gate. I tipped my hat. I said, "I'm Earl Dunmore, Pinun Creek North Road. I noticed you were running wash." She said, "I am." I said, "You need wood split." It wasn't a question. I could see the pile from where I sat, not much left. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I manage." I said, "I didn't say you didn't." I got off the horse. I went around the side of the house where the axe was leaning against a half-round of pine, and I split her wood for 2 hours while she went back to her shirts. She didn't thank me when I left, and I didn't expect her to. I told her I'd be back Friday with a cord from my timber cut, and she said she didn't take charity. I said it wasn't charity. I said she could pay me in winter when she had it. We both knew she wouldn't have it in winter. We both let that sit. The cord came Friday, and then another the following week. I'm going to try to tell this the way it actually was, which means not making it prettier than it was and not making myself better than I was. What happened with Nora Finn did not happen in a straight line. It doubled back on itself. It went cold and then came forward again. There were weeks I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. Thoughts are cheap. What matters is what you do. What I did, through November and into December, was keep showing up. I don't know what the name is for what made me do it. Wasn't pity exactly. Pity sits higher up, it looks down. This was something flatter, ground level, something more like recognizing. I knew what it looked like to be trying to hold something together with not enough and no one helping. I'd done it with the ranch in the bad years after the drought and the bank coming around. I knew the particular exhaustion of it, the way it gets inside your sleep, the way you wake up already behind. She was carrying that, and she was doing it while coughing, and she had 11 children who needed feeding. There are some things you just step into. The children were something I hadn't expected. I won't pretend I'd spent much time around children before that. My own marriage had been brief and had produced nothing and ended quietly, and I hadn't known quite what to make of children since. Their noise, their angles, the way they are always needing something or bumping into something or asking a question you don't have an answer to. But those 11. There was a boy named Caleb, 8 years old, skinny as a fence post, who had decided in the logic of children that because I showed up with an axe I must know about horses, and he followed me around with this specific silence that boys have when they want to ask you something and haven't worked up to it yet. He asked me, eventually, the 4th or 5th time I came, if I thought his father had been a good horseman. His father had died at Sutler's Creek, same fever as the others. I said I didn't know his father but that I'd heard good things. That was a lie, but it was the right one. There was a girl, oldest of the 11, 13 years old, name of Ida, who handled the younger ones with a gravity that shouldn't belong to a 13-year-old. She had appointed herself second in command under Nora, and she watched me from the doorway with a look that was pure assessment, not unfriendly, just calibrating. One morning she brought me a cup of coffee without being asked, set it on the fence post next to me, and walked back inside without a word. I thought about that for 3 days. I started coming twice a week instead of once. The feed situation was the thing that started pulling at me hardest. Nora had the children fed, barely, mush and beans mostly, dried venison when she could get it, but the winter was setting in hard and the margins were thin enough to see through. She was still washing for the miners, but the road to Sutler's Creek iced over in December and the turnaround time stretched out, and some of the miners had moved on, which cut her income. I went into town to Hal Breckenridge's store and I set up an account for her, flour, salt, dried goods, whatever she needed, and I told Hal to put it on my name and not to make a production of it. Hal made a production of it anyway, because Hal Breckenridge couldn't keep anything quiet if his life depended on it. By the following Sunday the minister knew, and the minister mentioned it in service, and Nora found out. She was waiting for me at the gate Monday morning. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No, ma'am. I do not want people thinking I can't." "Nobody thinks that," I said. "Everybody thinks you're about the most capable woman in the territory. What they think is you got 11 mouths and a bad cough and a dead man's claim and maybe a neighbor who ought to be helping." I got off the horse. "Let me put the cord up." She looked at me. Something moved in her face that she didn't let out all the way. "You're a hard man to argue with," she said. "I've been told." She let me put the cord up. She brought me coffee again, standing in the doorway of the house with her arms folded against the cold, watching me work. Ida stood just behind her left shoulder, watching the same way. The cough got worse toward Christmas. I rode to Prescott, and I got Dr. Aldous Crane, who was 60 years old and had delivered half the children in the territory and who I trusted, and I brought him back in my wagon on a Thursday when I knew the children would be in the schoolroom Nora had set up in the back bedroom. I wasn't trying to hide it from them. I just didn't want them frightened before there was something to say. Crane spent 20 minutes with her. He came out onto the porch and he said it was a deep bronchial inflammation, serious but not the consumption she'd probably been afraid of in the night. He gave her a compound. He said she needed rest, which was the funniest thing anyone had said in that house in some time, and he told her if she kept going the way she was going she'd be genuinely sick by spring. She thanked him quietly. After he stepped off the porch and out of earshot, she said to me, "How much does he charge?" I said, "Already settled." She turned to look at me. The afternoon light was flat and gray, winter light, and it came across the side of her face and showed everything that face had been through, the worry lines, the weariness, the set of the jaw that was pure stubbornness and also pure dignity. She was looking at me the way you look at a thing you've been trying to understand for a while and might be starting to. She said, "Why are you doing all this?" I thought about it. I said, "Because somebody ought to, and I'm here." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not really an answer." "It's the one I've got." She held my eyes a beat longer than she needed to. Then she looked away at the yard where two of the younger children were chasing each other around the water trough and laughing. She almost smiled. "Come in for supper," she said. "The children would like it." That was the first evening I ate at her table. 11 children at a meal is not a quiet experience. It's elbows and spilled milk and someone always crying about something that happened 3 rooms ago and still hasn't been resolved. The 4-year-old, a boy named Tobias, dark-eyed and solemn, climbed into my lap somewhere between the beans and the cornbread and just sat there like he'd been doing it his whole life. I didn't know what to do with that. I sat very still and kept eating. Nora watched me from across the table with an expression I couldn't entirely read, but there was something in it that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite sadness. Something steady. After the children were put to bed, a process that took Nora and Ida 40 minutes and involved at least one small negotiation I was not party to, she came back out to the main room, and we sat at the table with the lamp low, and she told me about Iowa, about the farm, about George, who had been a good man, careful and gentle, not built for the territory and too stubborn to admit it until the chest infection made the argument for him. She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people talk about things they've already made their peace with. I told her a little about my own years, not much, just enough, and she listened in that particular way she had of listening, which was fully and without interjecting. It was close to 10 o'clock when I stood to leave. She walked me to the door. I put my coat on. We were standing in the doorway with the cold coming in, and I said good night, and she said good night, and there was a beat. One of those beats where two people are standing close enough to feel the heat of each other in the cold air, and neither one moves. She put her hand on my forearm, just rested it there, flat, for 3 or 4 seconds. Then she said, "Thank you, Earl. Not for the wood or the doctor or the store account, just thank you for the whole of it." "You're welcome," I said. "I'll be back Wednesday." She nodded. I went out into the cold and rode home through the dark and didn't sleep much, which at 52 I'd stopped blaming on coffee. January was hard on the valley generally. 2 of the miners moved on entirely, which cut Nora's wash income in half. I brought beef over twice, said it was from a heifer I'd lost anyway and didn't want to waste, a lie she probably didn't believe but accepted without comment. I repaired the fence on the north side of her property, where the wind had knocked 3 posts loose. I fixed the door to the back bedroom that had been sticking since fall, and which 7 children had to fight every morning to get open. She was getting better with the cough, Crane's compound, and the fact that I'd quietly started arranging for someone else to make the run to Sutler's Creek so she didn't have to do it in the cold. She didn't know about that second part for a while. When she found out, she said mildly, "You arranged that." "Tom Reiser goes past there anyway," I said. "He does not go past there anyway. It is not on his way to anywhere. He doesn't mind." She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head with something that might have been exasperation and might have been the other thing. "Earl Dunmore," she said, "you are the stubbornest man I have ever met." "Heard that before," I said. "I believe you have," she said, and went back to what she was doing, and I thought I caught at the last second the edge of a smile. February is when I started to understand that I was not going to stop coming. I don't mean I decided it. I mean I understood it the way you understand the weather changing, something in the air before the evidence arrives. I'd been running the ranch for 15 years alone, not unhappily exactly. Alone is not the same as unhappy. But there is a particular weight you stop noticing you're carrying when you're the only one carrying it. And somewhere in January, it had gotten lighter. And I hadn't noticed until February when I tried to think about not going over there on Wednesday and felt the weight come back. I knew what that meant. I also knew I was 52 years old with a face that had been outdoors for all of them, and a ranch that was modest at best, and no particular practice at softness or sentiment or any of the other things a woman might reasonably want. I'd thought about this in the nights with the particular honesty that 4 a.m. produces in a person. I'd thought, she is 38 and strong-willed and running a small city of other people's children and has plenty on her hands without me making it complicated. I didn't say anything for a long time. What changed it was Caleb. Caleb had gotten comfortable enough with me by February that he would tell me things, not the things children say to adults to be polite, but the real ones. We'd been out behind the barn looking at the footprints in the snow where something had gone through in the night, fox, probably, and he had been quiet for a while, and then he said, in that sideways way of his, "Do you think Ms. Nora is going to keep being sick?" I said, "She's getting better. She was up coughing again last night." "Did she know you were awake?" "No." "That's probably why she got up," I said. "She didn't want to wake you." He thought about that. Then, "Is it because nobody's taking care of her?" 8 years old, skinny as a fence post. I didn't answer him right away. I crouched down and looked at the tracks some more. "Definitely fox, the pattern was right," I said. "I'm working on that, Caleb." He nodded. He seemed satisfied with that in a way I wasn't entirely sure I'd earned. But I went back in the house and I helped with supper and I stayed until the children were in bed. And when Nora came back out to the main room and sat across from me at the table, I said, without any particular build-up because I've never been able to do build-up, "I'd like to keep coming here. I'd like it to be with a clear intention." She looked at me. I said, "I know my circumstances. I know what I can offer and I know what I can't. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight." She said, "What are you asking?" "Permission to court you," I said, "properly if you'll have it." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. The lamp put shadows up the wall. Outside the wind was down for once and the night was still. Then she said, quietly, "You've been doing that since October." I said, "I know. I thought I should say it out loud." Another silence. She was looking at the table, at her hands flat on the wood, and I watched her profile in the lamplight, that strong jaw, the tiredness in her face that was also the most honest face I'd ever looked at, and I thought, whatever she says, I've told the truth, and that's what I've got. Then she looked up. "All right, Earl," she said. "Just that, all right." I rode home that night with the cold on my face, and the stars very bright above the rim and Creed trotting ahead of me on the road, and I thought, well, there it is. Something I thought I'd let go of so long ago I'd forgotten the shape of it. Spring came in slow and wet. The children planted a kitchen garden, all 11 of them, with Nora running the operation with the calm authority of a general and Caleb, and 2 others doing the digging, while Ida bossed the younger ones on seed depth with considerable severity. I brought over fence posts and helped Nora's oldest, a serious 13-year-old boy named Walt, who I'd mostly avoided because he reminded me uncomfortably of myself, build out the garden border so the deer couldn't get in. Walt didn't say much. We worked in comfortable quiet. Toward the end he said, "You're going to stay, aren't you?" "Not a question." I said, "That's the idea." He nodded and went back to hammering. I did ask Nora to marry me. Not in any way a story would arrange it, not at sunset, not with some planned speech. We were out by the fence in late April, the air just turning warm, and I had been thinking about it for 2 months, and I simply said it. She was looking at the mountains, and she kept looking at the mountains for a moment after I said it, and then she turned to me, and I could see she'd already decided, had maybe decided a while back, and was just letting herself get to it in her own time. She said yes. What I want to tell you, what I have not told many people in the years since, is what it felt like to stand in front of a minister in June with 11 children filling the front of that room and this woman beside me, her hand in mine, saying the words. I was not a man who believed a great deal by then. Not in institutions or in luck or in the idea that things work out. I'd been burned off those ideas one by one. But standing there with Nora's hand in mine and Caleb's gap-toothed grin in the second row, and old Creed somehow having gotten himself inside the church and lying under the last pew, I thought, all right, I was wrong about some things. Not everything, but some things. Nora looked at me just before the minister started. She looked at me the way she had that evening in the doorway in the cold, the flat and honest look that saw all of it, the worn face, the years, the stubbornness, the whole of me, and didn't flinch. She squeezed my hand, not a nervous squeeze, a decided one. I thought about those shirts on the line in October, the steam rising off the cold trough, the bent-over woman in the frost who didn't look up. All the things that almost didn't happen. We've been on the Pinon Creek place going on 9 years now. The ranch is bigger than it was. Walt has a head for cattle that I didn't expect, and he runs the east operation with 2 hired men of his own. Caleb is 17, tall, not so skinny anymore, already better with horses than I ever was. Ida married a young surveyor from Flagstaff last spring, and Nora cried at the wedding, which was the first time I'd seen her cry, and then straightened up and was herself again in about 4 minutes. The cough comes back on her some winters, not as bad. I watch for it. I notice when she's tired before she admits to it. I split the wood early and make sure the fire's right, and I don't make a speech about any of it, because that's not how either of us are made. She said to me once, we were sitting on the porch in the evening last fall, with the light going gold over the rim, she said, "You know, you didn't have to do any of this." I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it. No one would have thought less of you." I thought about that, the cord of wood in October, the doctor in December, the store account, all of it. I said I would have. She was quiet. Then she leaned her shoulder against mine and left it there, and we sat that way until the light was gone. That's all there is to it. That's the whole thing. A coughing widow with 11 kids who didn't ask for help, and a stubborn old rancher who gave it anyway, and here we are. Most mornings I'm up before she is, and I get the fire going and make the coffee, and there's a moment every morning, before anyone else is moving, where I sit with the coffee in my hand and the house quiet around me, and I think, yeah, I'd do it all again. Every cord of wood. Without thinking twice.